Lund University, 2023. Bachelor's Thesis. An essay by Peter Petrovic. Supervisor Tony Ronno Rasmussen. Title: An attempt to bridge the gaps between hard-determinism and compatibilism, and the difficulties of criticizing compatibilism with the consequence argument. Abstract. The free will debate is one which may carry heavy implications on normative morality and in society as a whole. Yet, it is one area of philosophy which garners much frustration and confusion. This paper attempts to clarify some of this. The thesis begins with presenting Peter van Inwagen's consequence argument. Later, Harry G. Frankfurt's freedom of the will and the concept of a person, and P.F. Strawson's freedom and resentment compatibilist theories are introduced, followed by a critical appraisal from the perspective of Inwagen's consequence argument. The result of this proving unsuccessful in adequately undermining the positions of the compatibilists, partly because of the vastly differentiating vantage point the aforementioned theories inherit. This thesis argues for the adaptation of an universal, common-sense understanding of the free will concept. This is done by criticizing compatibilists for often holding very obscure definitions of free will. The paper instead highlights how common sense people understand the concept of free will and advocates for this. The strength of this argument and the effect of implementing the common sense view remains somewhat unclear. Opening remarks, scope, and purpose. Can a person be morally responsible for an action they are not ultimately in control of? Are we really free, or are we just predictable agents who are doomed to closely follow the laws our universe put forth to us? Maybe we exist somewhere in the middle. These are heavy questions that have plagued philosophers for decades, and the answer to these questions might carry heavy consequences on how we ought to view life, punishment, and society. If we were to change our views on free will, it may merit drastic changes in how we structure and build our societies. Today, the majority of philosophers describe themselves as compatibilists and accept the view that the universe is causally deterministic, meaning that events in the universe are determined by previous events, resulting in a predictable future based on past occurrences. This essay rests on this axiom. Consequently, much of the debate narrows down to whether free will is compatible with the deterministic universe or not. Compatibilists argue that free will is compatible with determinism, while hard-determinists maintain that our brain is subject to the laws of causality in such a way that we cannot be genuinely free in any meaningful sense. This paper will outline and analyze this debate by examining the perspectives of two renowned compatibilist philosophers, followed by a critical appraisal by employing the vantage point of a prominent incompatibilist perspective. Harry G. Frankfurt's freedom of the will and the concept of a person and P.F. Strawson's freedom and resentment will represent the compatibilist viewpoint. For the incompatibilist viewpoint, the consequence argument in Peter van Inwagen's book, titled An Essay on Free Will, in which he lays out 3 arguments against compatibilism, will be contrasted to and critically applied to Frankfurt's and Strawson's thesis. I shall then argue that the consequence argument fails to touch the relevant compatibilist theories, and furthermore argue that perhaps it should have. I offer a broad critique for the compatibilist by questioning their understanding and adaptation of the concept free will. This will be done by arguing that we ought to instead adopt a common-sense understanding of what it means to be free, i.e., the naive determinist definition. To clarify, this paper won't go in depth regarding particular deficiencies or fallacies in the two employed compatibilist theories. Also, what this essay will not contend with is the very closely related area of moral responsibility and moral blame. Whilst it is acknowledged that most compatibilist theories are conjured up with this relevant issue in mind, it is not particularly relevant to the specific thesis this paper argues for. Moreover, this thesis does not concern itself with disproving a libertarian account of the universe, as it presupposes its invalidity. 1.1. What is free will? Various philosophers use the expression free will in slightly, and often inconspicuously, different ways. Therefore, it is important to establish and define exactly what the term free will entails, as to eliminate all possible confusion. This undertaking might prove to be more challenging than it appears at first glance. To illustrate this, consider the Cambridge Dictionary definition of free will. Free will, the ability to decide what to do independently of any outside influence. This appears to be a straightforward and non-problematic definition, one might think to themselves. However, what exactly do we mean by doing something independently? This has a potential to be interpreted in vastly different ways. One such way is to mean independently of all causal causes, whilst another interpretation might only consider the most surface-level obstructions an agent might encounter, such as someone acting differently whilst being blackmailed. Similar kinds of problematizations can be done with the words decide, influence, outside, and ability. Even seemingly well-worded definitions give us no tenable information unless we are given the correct context beforehand. Harry G. Frankfurt defines free will as follows: the statement that a person enjoys freedom of the will means that he is free to want what he wants to want. More precisely, it means that he is free to will what he wants to will, or to have the will that he wants. To understand this, one has to understand that Frankfurt categorizes and distinguishes between different kinds of desires. This section will provide a quick summary of that, as to make the reader familiar with key concepts as soon as possible. A more comprehensive view of Frankfurt's position will be spelled out in more fine detail in section 3.0. With that established, let us commence. Frankfurt uses his concept of first-order and second-order desires to explain how we can achieve free will. First-order desires are those desires that only relate to your most surface-level drives, i.e. all things that do not relate to any other desires. Such desires are also possessed by animals. An example of a first-order desire is the desire to eat ice cream. Second-order desires are the desires that relate and respond to the first-order desire, e.g. I wish I didn't want to feel the desire to X. When your second-order desires match your first-order desires and it moves you into action, you have achieved second-order volition. When a person secures his second-order volitions, then and only then does he become an agent of free will. Free will, in Frankfurt's estimation, entails having the desires that you want to have and acting on the desires that you want to act on. One way to interpret his use of free will is to see it as a mechanistic tool, ultimate control, or ultimate choosing of one's own volition. Although I believe this would be a pretty simplistic and unfair understanding of the term, seeing as determinism is incompatible with this type of free will, or at least unimaginably difficult. I find it utmost unlikely that Frankfurt intends to use it this way. However, he fails to make this crucial distinction explicit in his article, and I believe this to be a common point of friction between the compatibilist and incompatibilist perspectives. This is where the juxtaposition stands in many failed conversations between compatibilists and incompatibilists. I hypothesize that most incompatibilists adopt this understanding of this definition, that is, the ultimate choosing of one's own volition completely and ultimately freely in such a way that it makes an agent ultimately and directly in control of his actions. To even try to imagine what such a position entails is quite difficult. This position lacks coherency with respect to established metaphysical principles. I acknowledge I might be mistaken about such an universe, and reality could indeed be more perplexing than we can imagine. Nevertheless, I do not have the time to expand further on this point in this paper, and like previously mentioned, this paper relies on the axiom that determinism is true. On the other hand, compatibilists often do not define free will in this way. If this hypothesis is true, it is rather easy to see why this debate often feels frustrating, and why the incompatibilist and compatibilist often finds themselves arguing crosspoints. The naive determinist, let's call him, might argue, since Frankfurt doesn't comment on this particular point, I will assume he means ultimate free control of one's own fate. The naive determinist might continue this train of thought and think to himself in the following manner. But if everything is causally linked in this universe, then everything has prior causes out of our control. Therefore, we cannot entail that we are truly free to will what we want to will, because we cannot choose what moves us to want to have the will that we want to have, and so on. Thus, compatibilists are obviously wrong. The problem with this line of thinking is that it is very unlikely that this is how Frankfurt or most other compatibilists intend to use the term free will. I shall refrain from delving further into the rationale behind this. It is sufficiently self-evident as to why such a position is indeed very problematic to reconcile with determinism. That being said, I do believe the naive determinist has a point. Perhaps the only reasonable interpretation of such a bizarre metaphysical concept as free will encompasses is the naive determinist's interpretation. If the concept of free will makes no sense, then it is inadvisable to substantially alter the definition from its common sense understanding. I will comment more on this in section 6, 6.3. However, when free will is being used in this paper, it will refer to, unless explicitly noted otherwise, an agent being able to be free to will what he wants to will, or to have the will that he wants. In other words, I will adopt the naive determinist interpretation and definition, mostly for practical reasons. The concept of freedom to will what you want entails that you have the ultimate liberty to make your own choices and decisions regarding your beliefs and propositions, without being compelled or influenced by external factors. To clarify, this is a definition that certainly almost all compatibilists would dispute, but it will be used nevertheless. 1.2. How do we use determinism? This paper will define determinism as the following. Causal determinism is, roughly speaking, the idea that every event is necessitated by antecedent events and conditions together with the laws of nature. I believe this definition to be pretty non-controversial. Peter van Inwagen also deploys a similar definition of determinism. Different thinkers might understand determinism in slightly different ways. Some, like Strawson, even claim that they don't know exactly what determinism entails. However, further nuance on this topic is not deemed necessary for the main thesis being argued in this paper. Determinism simply encapsulates the idea that every action in the universe, T2, has prior causes directly influenced, necessitated, and preceded by T1. Even if we adopt a slightly different definition of determinism, it would, most probably, not change any content in this paper. 1.3 Other relevant distinctions. From now on, when the terms compatibilists and incompatibilist are used, they are meant to refer to the selective representation chosen in this paper, E. Strawson, Frankfurt, and Inwagen, unless specified otherwise. Incompatibilism is commonly separated in two branches, hard-determinism and libertarian free will. When the term incompatibilism is being used in this paper, it will be synonymous with and refer to hard-determinism. 2. The consequence argument, Peter van Inwagen, has produced quite some material on the issue of free will. However, this paper will only look at the arguments put forth for incompatibilism in his book, An Essay on Free Will. The consequence argument has sparked an endless thread of debate and philosophical discussions. This argument consists of 3 separate parts, but in his own words, these 3 arguments are meant to act as one larger unity, and it is referred to as the consequence argument. The complexity inherent in the literature becomes apparent at different junctures, and thus I will solely provide a concise overview of the argument. This approach may potentially compromise the thoroughness with which the argument deserves to be presented, yet time constraints prohibit a more extensive exploration. To understand the argument, we need to get familiar with the terminology Inwagen uses. Following principles are needed for the argument to succeed. An untouchable proposition is a fact that is such that nobody could have done anything about it at any point in time. For example, the fact that our sun was created billions of years ago, or that the speed of light is exactly 299,792,458 million meters per second, and so on. Additionally, the necessity notion indicates that if P is a necessary truth, meaning something that cannot be possibly false, then P is an untouchable proposition. And lastly, the conditional notion is the logical structure, the syllogism that follows. 1. It is an untouchable truth that P. 2. It is an untouchable truth that if P, then Q. 3. Therefore, it is an untouchable truth that P. The conditional notion is a very simple syllogism to understand. Now, it is universally accepted that the fact that our sun was created is an untouchable fact. Conversely, the fact that you had the desire to make coffee this morning and actually decided to execute on this desire doesn't seem like an untouchable fact. One might think to themselves, of course I could have had tea instead. However, Inwagen claims that this strong intuition between the separation of untouchable and touchable facts is simply a deception, given that determinism is true. This is what he aims to illuminate with the consequence argument. It is perhaps relevant to note that Inwagen doesn't claim whether or not we actually possess free will or not in this argument. He merely contends that if determinism is true, then it follows that we cannot possess free will. Furthermore, this free will, which we cannot possess, is exactly the type of free will that is relevant in discussions about moral responsibility and agency. 2.1. The logical structure. I shall now illustrate Inwagen's argumentation by presenting its logical structure. Firstly, let's assume that P stands for a proposition that, at some remote point in the past, completely encapsulates the entire universe. And secondly, L stands for the conjunction of all the actual laws of nature and physics. 1. If determinism is true, then it follows by necessity that if P and L are both true, then I write my thesis on the subject of free will. This is logically equivalent to 2. If P is true, and then if L is true, then I write my thesis on the subject of free will. 3. It is an untouchable truth that P is true. 4. It is an untouchable truth that, if P is true, then if L is true, then I write my thesis on the subject of free will. 5. Thus, it is an untouchable truth that if L is true, then I write my thesis on the subject of free will. 6. It is an untouchable truth that L is true. 7. It is an untouchable truth that, if L is true, then I write my thesis on the subject of free will. 8. Consequently, it is an untouchable truth that I write my thesis on the subject of free will. The strength of the argument evidently resides in how broadly it may be applied to all human behavior. Therefore, if determinism is accurate, free will cannot exist. On the other hand, in order to reject the argument, one must question the truthfulness of one or more of the following: untouchable propositions, the necessity notion, or the conditional notion. The consequence argument gets its name from the fact that all of our acts are a consequence of prior states of the universe. The argument can be simplified and understood in the following matter. We have no control over past events in the universe. We also do not have any control over the laws of nature. Given these facts, we cannot be free in any sense to act as we please. In order to be free in a deterministic universe, we would have to be able to change these untouchable facts, and untouchable facts cannot be altered by anybody since they are necessary truths. If you want to have control over effect X, you got to have control over the causes of it. Otherwise, one cannot be free. As mentioned previously, there is an abundance of responses to Inwagen's argument. Some critics agree that the conditional idea is the weak link. Other writers do their best to defend the main thesis and add their own details in order to improve the argument. Again, this is not something I will delve deeper in. 3. Harry G. Frankfurt's Compatibilism. To provide the necessary background for Frankfurt's claim that free will can coexist with determinism, I will elaborate on his compatibilist theory in this section. Frankfurt argues that the traditional notion of free will, which requires the ability to choose otherwise, is misguided. In his article, Freedom of the Will and the Concept of a Person, he lays the groundwork for his compatibilist theory. Frankfurt claims that any theory regarding freedom needs to meet the following condition, namely, why freedom of the will should be regarded as desirable. Naturally, he claims that his theory satisfies the longing for free will. When we are experiencing free will, certain desires are being satisfied, more specifically the desires that are of the second or even higher order, and in their absence we garner frustration. We may feel like a helpless and inactive spectator to the influences that are driving us. Like previously mentioned, he distinguishes between first and second-order desires. An example of a first-order desire is the desire to eat ice cream. First-order desires do not require any deeper conscious thought in order to form, meaning that one need not reflect or analyze a thought to make it a first-order desire. They are better understood as surface-level desires which do not relate to other desires. When an agent has a desire of the second-order kind, it means he has a desire to have a certain type of desire, i.e., I want to X. Conversely, when this second-order desire moves him into action and matches with his first-order desire, he is expressing the freedom of his will. Frankfurt calls this second-order volition. I shall provide a quick summary. First-order desires would entail a sentence like, I want to run a marathon. A second-order desire would entail, I wish I was a person who wanted to go and run marathons. And a second-order volition would sound like, I wish I was a person who wanted to go and run marathons, and indeed I do want that now in such a way that it moves me into action. It is only when one reaches his second-order volitions that one has achieved freedom of the will. Moving on, consider the statement A wants to X. The apparent simplicity of this statement is deceptive. It may be the case that A believes X is impossible or A is unaware of X and so on. Regardless of A's conscious perception and understanding of A wants to X and the related context, A wants to X, Frankfurt claims, still remains true and covers a broad range of possibilities. The expression A wants to X as a first-order desire does not indicate the relative intensity of the desire or preference in which it occurs. It is simply a data set which carries very little information. Contrast this with the statement A wants to X in such a way that it will move A to do X. It is only now that we can identify A's will. A may feel that he desires or intends to do X. In spite of this, he may not end up actualizing this. The concept of will does not always align with an agent's intended actions. Despite having a firm intention to perform X, an individual may ultimately choose to do something different. Thus, Frankfurt asserts that to decode an agent's will, it's crucial to pinpoint the desire or desires that ultimately ignite their actions. He contends that the concept of the will goes beyond the realm of first-order desires. The will cannot be equated with first-order desires alone. In order to clarify this, Frankfurt asks us to imagine a doctor who deals with drug addicts. This doctor, with the aim of providing more effective assistance to his patients, wants to understand them better. In accordance with this, he gets the idea that he wants to feel what his patients are feeling, i.e., the urge to take drugs. What this means in effect is that he wants to be moved to take the drug, to be nudged and be drawn towards it. But crucially, he doesn't want this feeling to actually move him into taking drugs. Rather, he wants to take the drug. He doesn't want this to be his effective first-order desire. Drawing the conclusion that the physician already desires to take the drug solely because he now wants to desire it would be inaccurate. His second-order desire to be moved to take the drug does not imply that he has a first-order desire to take it. The fact that he wants to X is not synonymous to the identification of his will. Wanting a certain first-order desire to be one's will is called a second-order volition. Frankfurt claims that having second-order volitions is essential to being a person. A person is someone who has volitions, i.e., a particular second-order desire. Meanwhile, a wanton doesn't. Animals and children fall under this category. Freedom of action equals the freedom to do what one wants to do. Freedom of the will equals the freedom to want what you want to want and to have it be effective. Even if a person has the freedom to act freely, that is freedom of action, they may not necessarily possess the willpower to execute their desired actions. If a person both possess freedom of action and freedom of the will, one is both free to act as one likes and to will what he wants to will. This, Frankfurt says, entails all the freedom it is possible to desire or to conceive. Frankfurt recognizes that his theory produces an infinite regress. The reason for this is because if we ought to value the higher levels of desires, then one might argue that you have a desire, and so on. This seems strange. How can we know if we even reach the highest order desire? However, Frankfurt doesn't think this is problematic in practice. He believes this to be more of a theoretical problem than something that might actually produce complexities in reality. One might have third, fourth, or maybe even fifth-order desires, yet this generates no serious threat against his compatibilism because you ought to value your highest-order volition. This will never end up becoming an infinite regress because at a certain point you will reach your highest desire, or more specifically, a desire upon which you are satisfied with, as Frankfurt puts it. The decisiveness of the commitment he has made means that he has decided that no further question about his second-order volition at any higher order remains to be asked. Whilst he does comment about the compatibility of determinism and free will, it is rather short. Frankfurt claims that his conception of the freedom of the will is neutral with regard to the issue of determinism. He postulates that there is no logical flaw in a person being causally determined to enjoy free will. Rather, it is given that some individuals enjoy the freedom of the will, whilst others simply don't. 4. Strawson's view. Strawson's article, Freedom and Resentment, has, like the other works referenced in this paper, garnered a lot of responses and debate within the philosophical community. I shall summarize Strawson's article to give the reader a sufficient understanding of his main points. Like with many works of philosophy, there exists an inherent subjectivity involved in its interpretation. Strawson's written work exhibits a somewhat conversational style, which might contribute to even a wider range of interpretations. It is important to acknowledge that alternate interpretations of Strawson's ideas exist among different philosophers, differing in various ways from the perspective I have presented. Nevertheless, I will strive to provide a reasoned and unbiased interpretation of his ideas in an attempt to present a fair understanding. I have written in section 1.0 that this paper shall not contend with the closely related area of moral responsibility and ethics in regards to the free will issue. Whilst this still stands true, it is critical to understand that Strawson's theory is presented in such a way that it is practically impossible to separate the very structure of the argument from normative ethics. Naturally, similar observations can be extended to Frankfurt's compatibilism, given that his theory is also produced with normative ethics in mind, yet in comparison, Strawson's position presents even greater challenges. What makes Strawson's article unique, and perhaps so popular, is the way he shifts the usual preconceived notion that it is the agent doing Act X who needs to be analyzed in order to justify and hold him morally responsible. Strawson flips this logic upside down and posits instead that responsibility is woven into the very nature of being, namely produced in the responder via our reactive attitudes. We need not intellectually analyze the agent responsible for action X. Instead, we ought to utilize a more pragmatic approach, a kind of psychological approach from the viewpoint of the responder. The focus in the article is focused on the reactors rather than the actors. Strawson remains skeptical to what a position like determinism exactly entails, But he also asserts that, given his thesis, it doesn't matter if determinism is true or not. His theory is compatible with a deterministic universe. Our reactive attitudes do not change in relation to the universe being deterministic or not. It is in this regard that Strawson is categorized as an compatibilism. If determinism is true, we may still uphold a kind of free will, at least one that is necessary for moral responsibility. 4.1. The concept of reactive attitudes. Strawson argues that in emotional states characterized by reactive attitudes, such as resentment, distress, gratitude, forgiveness, and so on, the notion of moral responsibility in the classical understanding of this concept becomes unattainable. During such moments, we instinctively regard individuals as morally responsible. This inherent tendency, according to Strawson, serves as a compelling rationale for upholding the treatment of individuals as morally responsible. This is the central thesis of Strawson's idea. Consider a scenario where somebody does you wrong in any conceivable way. If this person has an intention to inflict real harm to you and carries out that act, the consequence of this action will result in you, under normal circumstances, having no other choice but to feel a reactive attitude to the current situation, a feeling of resentment, perhaps. Likewise, if someone has done something you find praiseworthy, you will discover yourself producing a positive reactive attitude like pride or appreciation in response. However, if we just found out that the person doing the harm was mentally deranged, or if we just found out that he had a psychotic episode caused by past childhood traumas, our reactive attitude of resentment will be substantially altered in the direction of understanding compassion. We are in this way able to modify and change our reactive attitudes in accordance with new evidence and perspectives. Conversely, in a scenario where the person is simply morally underdeveloped, we naturally garner much stronger feelings of resentment. Our reactive attitudes are subject to change upon new, relevant information. This, self-evidently, has the idea of agency and agent responsibility built into it. If Strawson is right, humans project agent responsibility unconditionally. Alternatively, let us consider for a moment if we were to take an objective attitude instead. Following the same scenarios presented above, one might reason with themselves that this person is a result of a deterministic causal chain of which they are not ultimately, or at all, in control of. They cannot be responsible agents because they are not the true authors of their actions. Instead, we shall view them as natural phenomena, perhaps something akin to how we view primitive animals or natural disasters that harm people. Tsunamis that inflict unimaginable amounts of suffering are, of course, not good, however they cannot be held morally responsible. This objective attitude mirrors the sort of attitude a psychologist or behaviorist might take. In order for the hard-determinist to be consistent with his worldview, he would have to take the objective attitude constantly. This, Strawson believes, is practically impossible. Moreover, our adherence to the objective attitude would entail a loss of certain elements or aspects central to human life. What exactly this would entail is up to interpretation. Strawson believes our societies would be vastly different, and our social relationships would thus be rendered unrecognizable in an undesirable way. To summarize Strawson's entire article, the reactive attitudes serve as an inherent mechanism for instinctively attributing responsibility to individuals, without necessarily implying intellectual recognition of their status as free agents. These attitudes form the foundation of our practices of responsibility and are ingrained to such an extent that they cannot be eradicated. Accordingly, the essence of responsibility resides within our responses themselves. Strawson thinks it is imperative that we retain our pre-rational, i.e. our reactive attitudes, commitment to moral responsibility, as relinquishing it is not only undesirable but also inherently impossible, as a matter of psychological fact. 5. Applying the consequence argument on the compatibilists. Inwagen's argument appears to possess logical validity, although there exist differing viewpoints among certain philosophers. As previously mentioned, alternative iterations of the consequence argument have been put forth. However, for the purpose of this discourse, let us hypothetically assume the validity of Inwagen's argument. Likewise, let's also assume the validity of the compatibilist theories presented in such a way that they are at least not apparently logically flawed arguments. In doing so, does this present any significant challenges to Strawson's and Frankfurt's compatibilist stance? Given the definition of free will stipulated in section 1.1, i.e. free will, meaning the ultimate control of one's own volition, it makes the question rather clear. The implications of such a scenario are notably challenging to discern. If we were to juxtapose the arguments posited by the compatibilists and Inwagen, it becomes evident that the compatibilist perspective faces considerable difficulties, making it a less compelling position within this context. However, one may approach this analysis from a different perspective. Consider case example 1, Frankfurt, paragraph borrowed from section 3.0, quote, "If a person both possess freedom of action and freedom of the will, one is both free to act as one likes and to will what he wants to will. This," Frankfurt says, "entails all the freedom it is possible to desire or to conceive." Now, the natural succeeding question is, how may we understand this given the lenses of the consequence argument? Undoubtedly, one way to answer this question is to postulate that Frankfurt is simply confused. The word confused is perhaps a massive understatement. It is probably more accurate to claim that Frankfurt has lost his mind. The proposition that an agent possesses an absolute and boundless freedom, encompassing the capacity to alter untouchable facts, is absurd. This gives rise to significant metaphysical and logical quandaries when examined through the lens of the consequence argument. Given Inwagen's P, where P stands for a proposition that, at some remote point in the past, completely encapsulates the entire universe, and L, which encompasses the conjunction of all the actual laws of nature and physics, along with the propositional logic that follows, it can be inferred that Frankfurt's theory can be rendered useless. It is logically flawed given the framework the consequence argument puts forth. The fundamental idea that one's second-order volitions are free actions in any sense is simply a non sequitur. Instead, they ought to be seen as actions caused by prior causes which you had zero influence over. What influences one's actions and desires are all caused by untouchable facts. Another answer, which I believe to be at least partly correct, to this question may be, rather disappointingly, to simply say we can't. While taking into consideration the strongest possible interpretation of Frankfurt's claim, one must assume he is not talking about any ontological or even broadly metaphysical framework when referring to, for example, all the freedom it is possible to desire or to conceive. One may, of course, conceive of higher levels of freedom. This can be executed by simply employing the vantage point of God or any higher order of being. These things may be hard to conceive of, but certainly not impossible. Nonetheless, this is not Frankfurt's idea. A more reasonable interpretation, when he says, all the freedom it is possible to desire or to conceive, is to assume he means given our psychological and actual state in the universe. Perhaps something akin to Strawson's psychological, pragmatic approach. In light of this, it is hard to touch the essence of Frankfurt's compatibilism with the consequence argument. The reason for this being that the two viewpoints have distinct understandings of what it means for an agent to act freely. These differences make it extremely challenging to utilize one viewpoint to disprove or prove the other. When the naive determinist asserts that we cannot be free due to a range of reasons, they point to the concept of X, whilst the compatibilists point to the concept of Y to argue that, indeed, we can. They are not talking about the same thing, thus rendering the consequence argument's effort futile in regards to offering real critique to the compatibilist viewpoint. Case example #2, Strawson. The Strawsonian view exemplifies the challenges of applying the consequence argument with perhaps even greater degree of difficulty than Frankfurt's example. For followers of Strawson, the idea of a version of free will is deeply ingrained in the psychological fact of our reactive attitudes. It is closely tied to, and perhaps impossible to separate from, the notion of moral responsibility. Likewise, with example #1, the utilization of the consequence argument leads to a state of considerable disorder and absurdity. One needs not analyze deeply in order to see this. The very notion of a person's reactive attitude upholding any kind of truth value is alien to the consequence argument. The incompatibilist framework is simply not constructed to grapple with these types of compatibilists' theories. Are simply our reactive attitude chain, which can be contained in an absurdly long proposition, which consists of untouchable facts. Thus, the Strawsonian view is faulty. This is, of course, not a satisfactory rebuttal to the arguments put forth by compatibilist philosophers. Maintaining the incompatibilist framework in this regard entails missing the point of Strawson's thesis. I could naturally give plenty of more examples and delve deeper into the subject matter, but I believe I have made my point sufficiently evident thus far. One potential counterpoint to the arguments put forth here is to assert that criticism of compatibilist viewpoints are indeed possible using the consequence argument, as demonstrated by the previous analyses. Allow me to provide further clarification regarding my intended meaning when I say the compatibilist cannot be touched by the consequence argument. What I mean to say is that we cannot apply the consequence argument in such a manner that will convince any follower of Strawson and Frankfurt without misunderstanding these positions. In other terms, it would be a non-productive approach, since the vantage points of the incompatibilist and compatibilist differ so greatly. The incompatibilist understands the very notion of free will vastly different from the compatibilist. We simply cannot criticize the compatibilists using only the consequence argument without engaging in some form of strawmanning, misunderstanding, or miscommunication. This is why the compatibilists cannot be touched by the consequence argument. 6. Aligning compatibilists and incompatibilists. I believe the analysis in section 5.0 to be indicative of the point I hypothesized about in section 1.1 regarding the vastly differing understanding of the term free will that incompatibilists and compatibilists employ, and how this produces complications. However, the question remains: how can we reconcile this disparity in order to facilitate moral and philosophical progress? If we shared a common understanding of what it means to exercise freedom of the will, then this may perhaps accelerate our philosophical understanding of the world, along with the advancement of our normative moral theories. I shall now argue for the adaptation of a common-sense understanding of the term free will. It is evident that the compatibilists believe free actions to be caused by agents' psychological states. This is distinctly different from the hard-determinist viewpoint. Nevertheless, can we genuinely subject their definitions to critical scrutiny? Can we ever claim that someone has a wrong definition of something? In my estimation, I contend that indeed we can. Furthermore, not allowing this critical appraisal leads to undesirable conclusions. Endorsing a viewpoint that deems any individual's definition as valid is hugely problematic, as certain definitions may hinder or complicate philosophical and/or moral progress. Thus, we should strive for a philosophical and moral landscape where not all definitions hold the same force. 6.1. Experimental philosophy and adopting the common-sense view of free will. Other philosophers have advocated for the use of a common-sense understanding of free will before, perhaps most notably, Daniel Dennett. However, my definition of the common-sense view, along with the argumentation that follows, differs greatly from Dennett's. When most people use the term free will, I believe they are expressing a libertarian, ultimate freedom of one's own volition type of free will, i.e. the type of understanding that a naive determinist might adopt, and the type this paper has chosen to adopt as its definition. If anyone doubts this assertion, I urge you to engage in conversations with individuals who do not possess a particular interest in philosophy. Upon doing so, you will most likely discover that my statement is indeed accurate. Most people possess a quirky metaphysical worldview which is hard to defend using reason and philosophical discourse alone. Nonetheless, to back up this claim properly, I shall reference a study from 2019, which shows that the majority of United States and Singaporean citizens believe in a type of free will that encompasses the following definition. Free will is the ability to make different choices even if everything leading up to one's choice, that is, the past, the situation, and their desires, beliefs, etc., were exactly the same. This is exactly indicative of the naive determinist, common sense, understanding of being free. 85% of Singaporean participants reported identifying with this libertarian understanding of free will, and respectively 83 for the US sample size. This supports the hypothesis that most people adopt a very straightforward understanding of the concept of free will, and this is what I call the common sense view. It is the understanding of free will that would entail ultimate freedom and ultimate choosings of one's own volition. I believe it to be reasonable to assert that any individual who has a sufficient understanding of the English language and who employs basic rational reasoning would typically perceive freedom to possess a genuine sense of autonomy, rather than the constrained interpretation adopted by the general compatibilist thinker. When the compatibilist philosopher is talking about free will, he is clearly not talking about freedom of the will as most people would understand it. Any common-sense understanding of freedom would entail such freedom to be free from prior causes. You are not free if you didn't ultimately choose what you wanted to do. I believe this critique or analysis, whatever you want to call it, to be applicable to numerous compatibilist philosophers. When compatibilists talk about free will, they are perhaps making a categorical mistake by defining the meaning of freedom in an obscure manner. The very essence of their theories being presented as justifying and or unifying free will with determinism can be deemed as a priori and commonsensically impossible. Bizarrely enough, I believe that most compatibilists would in a way agree with the previous sentence, given the context and understanding in which it is written. It is important to bear in mind the compatibilist thinker doesn't defend the common-sense understanding of free will to be compatible with determinism. Thus, they would see the logical validity with the aforementioned sentence. It is just that they define free will to be something else from the common-sense view, and consequently still persist that determinism is compatible with free will in, quote, this other way. My response to this would be that if you desire to express an entirely new concept, differing from the common understanding of free will, why not introduce a new term? It seems very peculiar to define compatibilism with this and postulate freedom of the will in this way. This is not what most people mean by freedom. This argument, I realize, is me essentially directing a pointed and impassioned critique towards compatibilists pertaining to the proper application of definitions. They may respond, who cares? I can define it how I want since it is my definition. But again, they are doing a disservice to themselves. I shall elaborate more on this point in section 7.2. I recognize one needs to tread carefully here as not to make an argumentum ad populum, i.e. appeal to the masses fallacy. I want to clarify that I'm not implying that if the majority of individuals shifted their understanding of free will in such a way that the naive determinist understanding would no longer be the norm, then this would cause the common-sense position to falter. The reason for this is because I still believe the very fundamental and conceptual understanding of the terms free will encompasses the libertarian notion. I believe this to be a psychological truth of our semantical understanding of the English word freedom. One would need to alter the English language in such a way that a rational agent would not inherently understand freedom to encompass the naive determinist understanding of freedom. In such a scenario, I concede that my argument would become untenable. 6.2. The issue of problematic definitions. To highlight the issue of definitions that differ from the common sense understanding, consider the following exchange between two people, Mark and John. John makes the claim that he can fly. Mark stares at him, utterly confused. "No, you can't. That's impossible given the laws of gravity and human anatomy." At that moment, John swiftly responds, "Oh, yes, I can. Watch me," and then proceeds to run across the hallway. Now ask yourself, is it true that John can fly? If we were to adopt John's apparent understanding of the term flying, then the answer would be yes. But I believe it to be fair to question the validity of this claim. We may permit ourselves to ask, is that really an acceptable definition of flying? The common sense approach to this scenario would say, no, of course not. This is not how our language works. John can respond to this criticism by claiming that it doesn't matter how he defines flying, since it's his own definition. He might even reason further and claim that we need the concept of flying to ground our normative ethics on. He says, for example, without the concept of flying, we cannot hold agents morally responsible, and we need to be able to hold agents morally responsible in order to maintain society. Hence, my definition solves this vital problem. Most people would garner a strong intuition to feel like Mark has indeed not provided a sufficient idea of flying in order to justify agent responsibility with his definition. Humans cannot fly, so to claim that humans need to fly in order to develop his moral theory, it seems that we are simply pretending that we can fly. This is, in various ways, something akin to what the compatibilists do when they postulate that they have solved the problem of free will by assigning the term free will to solely encompass agents' psychological states. This is, in my estimation, not fair. If I were to assert in this paper that I possess the ability to fly, would such a notion be accepted? While one could argue in favor of the notion that one has the capacity to fly, it would be disingenuous to make such a claim. Furthermore, it doesn't actually touch or resolve the original question which tries to answer, can humans really fly? If I were to say yes to that question, such a response would be indicative of a categorical mistake pertaining to the notion of what it means to really fly. When pressed further by a frustrated Mark, who persists that the laws of nature render John's claims clearly impossible, it garners no effect on John. Instead, John now doubles down and says, "Oh gosh, don't be ridiculous. Of course I can't fly in that way. Nobody can. Don't be absurd. This is what flying really means." He then proceeds to explain running. Again, even though it may be technically valid to define flying in any desired manner, there seems to be something, a priori, disingenuous with John's approach. Perhaps this is not an exceptionally compelling argument, but I do believe there is something valuable in this example. If philosophers care about progressing and moving closer to some kind of truth or consensus, then we ought to universalize our understanding of what it entails to exercise freedom of the will. What this does not imply is that we cannot continue our normative discussions about how we ought to live life, or debating agent responsibility and so forth. I am merely asserting that calling it free will is disingenuous in the same way as John's apparent flying. Imagine a scenario where John is trying to argue with a group of people who are fly skeptic. What are the chances this would, realistically, entail a productive discourse? Very low, I believe. Furthermore, most people do actually believe that John can fly, but John himself doesn't really believe that he can fly. Not in the obvious, common sense, most intuitive understanding of the word flying. Most people believe John can actually fly in the same way most people believe in the libertarian concept of free will. This fact further amplifies the unnecessary complexity of this, already very complex debate. To provide clarification, John naturally represents the compatibilist in this scenario who believes in free will, but just not the same type as most people do. Now, if John just admitted this and argued instead in the following line of thought, "Hey, you know what? I cannot really fly since flying for most people actually means becoming airborne. However, I can run, and this is why running is important for X." And so on. Then, navigating this debate would become much more productive and less frustrating. This, I argue, is better, at least purely from a pragmatic perspective. 6.3. How to understand the common-sense adaptation of the free will concept. What I am presenting is a practical argument, essentially advocating the following standpoint. Let us collectively acknowledge that the concept of free will is unattainable. Not only is its practical implementation dubious in various ways, but it is also challenging to even start to conceptualize the parameters and implications of such a position. Given the universe's deterministic nature, it logically ensues that the capacity for free will is absent in humans. While we might conceive of conscious entities endowed with such volition, humans, demonstrably, do not belong to this category. Perhaps it is possible to imagine such conscious agents who do in fact possess this type of freedom of the will. However, humans are clearly not characteristic of such beings. Such agents would be spectacular beings, capable of being the true authors of their destiny, directly being able to influence prior causes in a way that is not determined by other related prior causes. Perhaps, most fittingly, we would call such agents gods. Consequently, we should progress beyond this notion, refrain from employing the term free will, and stop identifying as compatibilists. Most rational agents would understand the concept of freedom in the common sense view. Thus, let's adopt this view universally. Does this mean we need to abandon our compatibilist theories? No, of course not. If we want real progress, let's use the common sense definition of free will so as to unify our moral language and circumvent past petty semantic discussions. It is of utmost importance to make it clear that I am not saying compatibilist philosophers, both the selected representatives in this paper, but also in general, are right or wrong. I remain impartial on the matter at hand. This point cannot be stressed enough. What I am expressing is simply this. Let us acknowledge that the discourse between compatibilism and incompatibilism revolves around different concepts. For example, it may be the case that Frankfurt's theory is correct, in the utmost meaning of the word correct, but I still do not believe what he is describing is freedom of the will. If you doubt this is the case, again, I point to Marx's definition of flying. It is simply not satisfactory. This is not how most humans understand the concept of being free. We may possess something, but it is not free will. I realize some readers may view this argumentation to be obscure or enigmatic, or furthermore that there is no real argument being produced here. I share that concern. I remain not entirely convinced by the adaptation of the common sense view of free will and thus all the practical implications of it. One rebuttal to this paper is to question one of the claims made in section 1.0, that is, do compatibilists even want to reconcile free will with determinism? Perhaps they only wish to move the discussion to an area of normative ethics and postulate that it is not important if we enjoy true cosmic freedom or not. This may very well be true, but my point is, then one ought to admit that indeed we do not possess free will, and instead reason along the following lines. We don't possess true cosmic freedom, but these other things, X, Y, and Z, which I won't call free will anymore, are still important. One counterpoint to this view is that it may be risky to abandon the concept of ever attaining free will. My response to this is we already, mostly, have. At least in the philosophical world, most philosophers don't believe in the naive determinist definition of free will. Taking the little extra step and abandoning the concept entirely won't necessarily imply radical changes. Remember, we can still move past the bizarre concept of free will and talk about something else. We can still uphold theories that offer moral blame and so on. It is more of a conceptual, semantic shift rather than any serious philosophical shift. Another further counterpoint is to say that my argument is a gross oversimplification of the very complex landscape and broad literature pertaining to the issue of free will. It may be the case that we cannot adopt the universal common sense understanding of free will for this very reason. However, I am afraid that critics who reason in this following manner are at risk of misunderstanding my position. I am only pertaining to our practical methods of doing philosophy. I am thus not pertaining to the specific truth value of any compatibilist or incompatibilist theory. I realize these matters are considerably more complicated than what my arguments perhaps makes it out to be, but what I have put forth here is a pragmatic argument in hopes of making our philosophical discourse more effective and less confusing. 7. Summary, closing remarks, and further speculation. In this paper, my aim has been to demonstrate the troubles of applying the consequence argument on two prominent compatibilist thinkers, Harry G. Frankfurt and Peter Frederick Strawson. Furthermore, I have argued for the adaptation of the common sense understanding of what it entails for an agent to act freely. The debate on free will is of utmost relevance in today's society. Philosophers are nowhere near reaching a consensus on how we ought to view punishment, agent causality, the implications of the existence of free will or the non-existence of it, and a plethora of other related problems. Nevertheless, I remain optimistic for the future. One safe assumption I dare to make is that future generations will have to contend with this issue for the foreseeable future, especially when pertaining to AI-level intelligence. As mentioned previously, I remain skeptical of my own argumentation in this paper. Perhaps one can manage to steelman the main thesis, or alternatively, it has an inherent fault in which renders my thesis effectively useless. Lastly, allow me to speculate further. I emphasize again, the following section is mostly unfounded, anecdotal speculation. Please do not misconstrue this as a substantiated or rigorous argument. Nevertheless, whilst I acknowledge that my tone may sound arrogant, it seems abundantly clear to me that a considerable number of compatibilist philosophers are in fact, for all practical purposes, incompatibilists in disguise. They may adopt compatibilism solely because it aligns better with their moral beliefs and appears more convenient and pleasant, leading them to deceive themselves. They often do so by twisting the meaning of free and freedom in such a way that it no longer holds any true meaning to be free. It appears nearly as though the generic compatibilist thinker has a preconceived notion which holds free will as a necessary component in his normative theory. This doesn't seem to be right. One may argue at length regarding this topic, but there seems to be something prima facie disingenuous here. Perhaps what the compatibilists often do is that they go from what free will is to what free will ought to be, in a prescriptive sense, without first giving the proper justification to perform this leap. However, it seems to me, rather unfortunately, that much of the confusion and disagreement between many incompatibilists and compatibilists thinkers can be boiled down to semantic disagreements. Thank you for listening to this audiobook.